everyone. Good afternoon, depending on where you are. My name is Daniela Vintila. I'm the chair of the CCPR Standing Group on Migration and Ethnicity, which is a group that I'm coordinating with my colleagues Roberta Perna, Verena Wistaler, Sebastiano Vieres, and Naval Shabayar. We are very, very pleased to welcome you today to this new session of our webinar series. It's a very practical session, if you wish, a session in which we are going to discuss basically about different ways in which we can communicate migration research, both to academic audiences, but also to non-academic audiences. So our invited guest today is Jan Rath, professor at University of Amsterdam, as you know. He is also the editor of this prestigious journal that we have in migration studies, which is International Migration. Jan is also, you have several hats, right? You are also the chair of Metropolis International, and he has also been advisor to different local, national, supranational organizations, including, for instance, the OECD, the UN, the IOM, OSCE, the European Commission as well. So today, Jan has very kindly agreed to basically share with us a little bit from his expertise on engaging with scholarly audiences, but also disseminating migration research to policymakers and to practitioners. On behalf of the standing group, of course, Jan, thank you very much once again for having accepted the invitation to participate in this seminar. As we discussed, you will have around half an hour for your presentation, and then we will open the floor for questions from the audience. So for all the other participants, let's try please to mute our microphones during the presentation of Jan. And if you have any comments or any questions, you can either write them directly in the chat and I will read them afterwards, or you can simply intervene using the function of raise your hand during the Q&A. So without further ado, Jan, the floor is yours for about half an hour. Thank you so much.
Okay, well, Thank you very much. Well, in fact, I feel very honored to be invited here and to get the opportunity to share some of my experiences and my thoughts. It won't be entirely practical because I think it's important to reflect on who we are and what we are doing in this world and which role we as social scientists can have and what we can expect from the people out there to whom we talk, and what kind of expectations are realistic or not realistic. So I will touch on that, but I will conclude, at least sort of the second part will be mainly very practical suggestions about the different ways to communicate and what are the things that you need to keep in mind when you do that. And I prepared a presentation, so you won't see me for half an hour. I will only show the my PowerPoint, but later I will switch it off. All right. So here we are. Okay. So what I will do is actually the following. The first question is, why the hell are we interested in communicating and disseminating our research findings? For whom is it relevant? Is it for us relevant? Or is it for policymakers relevant, or for the people whom we studied? A few things to say about that. Then I will zoom into the intricacies of the research policy nexus, which is much more complicated than many people think it is. I will touch upon the changing environment in which we operate. When I started my career, it was in the previous millennium. It was fine to publish one small piece in a year, and if you wouldn't be able to do that, that would be fine. And I'm from the Netherlands, so publishing in Dutch would be perfectly fine. And nobody had even the idea to reach out to colleagues or other folks who could have been interested outside the borders. Those things have fundamentally changed. Then, and probably this is the most important thing, it's about the development of a communication and dissemination strategy. And so I think it's important not to do this ad hoc, but from a sort of a plan. What do you want to accomplish? And then a few of the to-dos or not to-dos, or what is it, when you publish a journal article, or at least you wish to publish a journal article or a book or report. And of course, hereafter, there's the opportunity for you to ask questions or comments or whatever you want to bring into the discussion. Well, why are we doing this? I mean, the reason is very simple. I mean, we are interested in the world, and we claim that we are able to provide insights and provide data that help us, but not just us, but anybody else, to understand what's going on. And so if only for that very particular reason, it's important to think about our publication strategies. When we are externally funded, the funders want to know what you did and how you did it and whether or not it's of sufficient quality. Some funders, and increasingly more and more funders, they want to know not just who you are and what your credentials are, or which plan you have and how you want to advance social science, but they're particularly interested in how do you want to disseminate your findings once you have completed the project. And you already need to include those details, which means that you need to think about it before you can even start a project. And finally, it's important to reflect, finally, communication and dissemination is important because it's the mechanism that we use, or at least it's part of a mechanism that we have to check each other. So whether or not we do things properly in an academic sound way that is defendable, whether or not the facts or the insights that you have developed are really the latest and the best thinkable, we need to be able to show what we did to other people, and they can comment on it, they can critique it, they can say, well, it's fantastic, whatever they want, but it's their evaluation which is important. It's part of the legitimation of the academic quality that we claim that we have. And it's only possible if there is an open communication possible, by researchers to anybody else. Increasingly, these sort of the communication and dissemination is targeting a sort of a layman's public, but it's not just that. It's also reaching out to our peers, well, you know that when we are encouraged to publish in journals, it's important to get the right journals. I'll come back to that later, but it's also part of the legitimation of our work, but also the sort of the evaluation of the quality and the relevance. And so we know that when you publish in a journal with a high impact factor, and I will come back to that later again, but it's important because it tells something about our quality, how good we are, or how so we are. So these are all things that are part of the, this world of science. So social science in particular, we are dynamic and we need to be open. And we need to be open to the rest of the world. And this already has numerous implications. So let's say you get an assignment from a ministry or a municipal government or any other foundation. It's important that we argue that we have the right to publish it, whatever the outcomes. And keep in mind, this is not self-evident. Not in every country it's self-evident. Well, that brings us to the connection between researchers and policymakers. I'm aware that what we do is not just to policymakers. There are other people in this world who are interested in our findings, who are maybe desperately waiting. Let's say activists, community committees, or whatever you have, journalists. But here I focus on the research policy nexus. And many of us, not all social scientists, but many find it important that what they find is shared with policymakers is brought under the attention of policymakers, if only because we assume that this will help the development of policies. Because after all, we live in a world that is, well, as a quite rational structure, it's important that when decisions are made about the spending of public money or decisions that impact the opportunities of individuals or groups in society, we want to know that this is not based on common sense, but this is based on the most recent objective knowledge that is thinkable. But things are much more complicated than that. So at the bottom here of this slide, you see the references that I'm basing myself on. It's actually an old paper, but some old papers are still good. And this one is interesting because it points to the relative position of us researchers. So we are not alone in this world. Say policymakers are not just dealing with the concerns that have been central in our research project. In fact, policymakers mainly deal with social problems, but there are too many social problems. And so you see a kind of a competition between social problems to be acknowledged as such, and that would encourage governmental institutions to pay attention to it, to invest in it, or to change the way of doing things. But it also means that if we do research that contribute to the understanding of a particular social problem, you cannot take it for granted that governmental officials are really interested in it. It's contingent on a lot of things. And it's partly because we live in a sort of, we operate in an institutional arena where, as I said, there's a competition for social problems to be acknowledged. There are particular interests with researchers, but also lobby groups or other, organizations that have a particular interest in getting particular problems on the social agenda or removing it from the agenda. We also need to deal with what's called the carrying capacity of policymakers. They can only deal with an X number of issues at the same time. A day has only 24 hours. A week has only 7 days. So let's say today there's the economic development, there are housing issues, there's an international war going on, which has profound implications for international relations. Well, all those things, they demand for political attention, and it's clear that it's not possible to address each issue in the same way. The implication, or let me show you the rest of what I wrote, but the implication is that this impacts the way we operate. So when we want to reach out to policymakers or to other institutions in this world, we need to be aware and be prepared to understand that it's not unlikely that there is no interest at all. Or maybe that it will take a few years before people finally understand the implications of your writing. So it makes our position quite relative. So while this is happening, the academic community or the institution of academia has been changing as well. So there was the introduction, well, I say recent, but that's only what old people would probably write. But there's the introduction of new standards. And we have to prove that we comply to those standards. There are the accreditation procedures. There are the REFs, so the research assessment practices that have profound implications. Whether or not you're able to maintain your job as a researcher, whether or not you or the center or department in which you work will continue to receive funds, whether your research interest will be central in a research program. To a large extent, it's contingent on these kind of quality measures, and so and one way of measuring quality is by exploring publications, the number. So but it's not just number; it's also what type of publications, what type of journals, what type of publishing houses, or maybe other outlets, other ways of sharing that, and that together is assessed, is evaluated, and that has an enormous influence on what we can do as researchers. And increasingly, this is not done just locally, it's part of an international competition. So you're all aware of the rankings. The rankings, there are these biometric systems that sort of also rank for who is relevant, who has influence, and all these matters matter. They all sort of are part of the world in which we operate, and in which the way we publish, the way we communicate our findings, is an important element. Some people, and I was the academic director of an institute in Amsterdam, and some staff members thought, well, this is nonsense. It's quality will eventually find its way to the public. And the only thing I thought is, okay, well, dream on. You need to take an active position. You can't just wait till people finally discover how geniusly you are. And so this is not how it works. So publishing is key. It's important. At the same time, we can observe, not everywhere, but here and there, a call for what's called slow science, because all these rankings and evaluations, assessments, etc., the competition that's consequent to that has led to a very fast changing system of publishing. I spoke to a colleague of mine. In fact, I had to evaluate his work, say 2 years ago. And he said, well, last year I published 10 articles. Well, you could say 10 articles, that's brilliant. But the only thing that comes to my mind, what is the fundamental added value of article number 4 or 5 or 9? And so at the same time, I really understand why you want to publish more, because that's also the world we live in. When you publish 3 articles, then you think, oh, why not 4? When you publish 4, it's too bad I couldn't publish 5. So the dissatisfaction is part of our system, or at least of my system. But still, does it have an added value? And so some individuals, they say, well, maybe it's time to stop this enormous pressure on publishing more and more and more, because the influence, the information that you can find in individual papers is actually decreasing. And so what you do, instead of publishing one excellent paper, you publish 3 papers that are sort of overlapping, but just a wee bit different. But it also means that it's 3 times as much work. And us as readers, as consumers of that knowledge, we have to go through all those papers. And maybe there's a better way to spend my time. Then, what I think is important, if we want to sort of move on in this world, it's important to think about ourselves, what we do and what we want to do. What is it that we want to accomplish? So why are we involved in research? For whom are we doing that? And how do we want to communicate to the rest of the world? And I think it's important to develop your own individual communication and dissemination plan. What I always see is that people say, well, we will publish, say, 2 articles a year, and after 3 years, an overarching book. And I write a short note that I will circulate to policymakers. And then I covered all the things. But I think that's way too simplistic. that's way too simplistic. First of all, because it's only about writing, as if writing documents is the only way to communicate. And also because it ignores this whole world of different ways of communicating. So we have the social media, there are all these blog systems. You can go to meetings, both formal meetings or informal sessions with policymakers, with journalists, with the deputy mayor or whoever. So it's all those, they are all part of sort of this, or should be part of the strategy that you need to develop in order to make decisions how much time you want to spend on what. And let's look at some of the elements. So first of all, we need to think, how do we want to communicate in what role? As a regular researcher, and there's nothing wrong with it because most of us are regular researchers, or we want to be in the forefront of research, theoretically very advanced. Both are fine, but we need to think about that. And keep in mind, when you say, well, I see myself as a regular researcher, of course, 2 years from now, you're entitled to change your position. Say, well, but with this project, I want to do it different. Do you want to be somebody who knows a lot about, say, international migration and diversity management? Or you want to be somebody who doesn't have that overview, at least not very thorough, but who is a specialist on labor market participation? It's both things. I think the world needs both of us, but it's important that you make a decision what you want to be, because your publication strategy is contingent on that. And last but not least, we also need to think about, what type of researcher do we want to be? A researcher that serves the public, a researcher that serves policy, or a critical researcher who sort of only speak to other critical researchers, or anything else. So it's important to sort of consider those different varieties before really embarking on publishing. And then, of course, apart from the publics, it's also the language. We are communicating in English now. But I'm from the Netherlands, so I could also write papers in Dutch. Now, sometimes you have the opportunity to write things in languages that you yourself can't read. I have a paper in Japanese. I have no idea what it says, so I need to trust the translator. But at least the main languages, we need to make a decision about that. Which forms and styles, all those things are important. And so you need to have an overview of all the possibilities and then make a decision. Right. As for practicality, so let's say you decided to at least to bang out a book. Yeah, you want to write a book. What do you do? Well, first of all, you need to do research, and you need to do it well and make sure that you report about it. But it's important, two things. First of all, that you contact at a very early stage a publisher, and that a publisher agrees or at least demonstrates an interest in reading the manuscript. And you need to think about, okay, if it's that publisher, then I need to frame my research in that logic. But if it's a different type of publisher, you may need to alter that. So what you want to do with your research also determines the publisher and the other way around. But also important, very important, is that getting a contract from a publisher does not mean that your research is excellent. Or being refused a contract does not mean that your research is lousy. Well, it could be, but not necessarily. Publishers, they publish because they hope that a particular book will be sold. That's the main thing. They may have some other interest in publishing. They want to contribute to a body of knowledge, but the primary reason is sell books, because that's the reason for their existence. So that's something that you sort of need to figure out. So for instance, you have a case study about labor market issues in Belgium or in Switzerland. It will be very difficult to find a publisher in the US, simply because if you want to get a book published in the US, you need to have chapters, at least chapters about the US. So the choices that you make by designing your own project to some extent influence the choices that you have for international publishers. Well, what you do when you want to contact a publisher, you need to have a book synopsis, a short version of the book, but that needs to have a couple of items, 4 or 5 pages max. Don't type it full of text. I mean, that's only annoying. But have a clear title, a clear and challenging title. You need to have a text that describes what the book is about and why it's interesting. Why is it relevant to have that manuscript published? And you can't expect that publishers know everything, but you need to make that clear very concisely. And that means that you need to at least say why you are doing this. So which hole in the literature, which gap, which flaw do you want to address? So you need to have a theoretical point. And a theoretical point is not, I'm writing about gentrification. That's not a theoretical point. But what exactly do you want to add to the literature? And it's also important not to sort of puke out your entire theoretical knowledge. That's not relevant. That's not a study. You need to develop a point, explain to which sort of discussions, debates you want to speak to, and you all summarize that in, say, a few pages, period. That's all. And then, of course, publishers are interested in getting an impression of what type of chapters will you do. How have you come to write this? You can say it was a dissertation. Probably it's better not to say that. You say, I did a study. Because with dissertation, they think, it can't be good. You say, I carried out a research project, and this is what it is. It took me 3 years or 4 years or 12 years, whatever. If it's an edited volume, then you need to explain why you decided to have an edited book as an outcome, how the writing process occurred, how original it is. So what other books are you competing with? Right? So you just list 3 or 4 titles. Well, the readership, is this a study book, a handbook, or is it a monograph? So those are things that you need to say. Well, there's a couple of other items, and they want to know when can we receive the manuscript? And all this in 4 to 5 pages, not minuscule fonts, but this is it. And keep in mind, this will be read by, let's say, an editor who is responsible for sociology or for migration studies. But it will also be read by somebody else from the same publishing house dealing with marketing. So it's multiple people will reflect. Maybe they send it out to a couple of colleagues of us. We don't know. But the colleagues who are expected to be more in the know, they can say, well, this is interesting, or not again. And so it's make sure that what you write is sound. Well, you can also decide against publishing a book, but say, no, I want to bang out a journal. Well, I'm on the editorial board of international migration, but this applies to any other journal. It's first of all, it's important that you, on the basis of your research and the type of research, but also on the basis of your publication and dissemination strategy, decide to what journal you want to submit your chapter. And it's the many elements that are important. So when your research is based on a huge quantitative database, then some journals are totally useless because they tend to publish more qualitative stuff, and vice versa. Don't take it for granted that because I think most of you are in migration studies, that only migration studies journals are of interest. It totally depends on your topic. So I myself wrote a lot about migrant businesses, migrant entrepreneurship. Well, I published in the Journal of Ethical Migration Studies and International Migration too, but also in the Journal of Small Businesses. So the multiple ways to deal with that. But keep in mind, when you publish in a general journal, you need to introduce your topic in a slightly different way, because you're speaking to another readership. It's always helpful to sort of skim a couple of journals. So check out the contents of the past year to find out if your paper fits that. What many journals like is that you continue on a discussion that started a few years ago in the same journal. So there is an accumulation of knowledge. Look at the impact scores, but don't make the mistake that you say, I want to go for the highest. You can always do that, but not when you're relatively young. It costs way too much time. You need to be practical. Don't go for the easiest one either. To sort of explore a journal that you think would nicely fit your interest. And what you then do, you can contact the editors, or at least one editor, not all of them at the same time, and say, would you be interested? And maybe they say, well, yes, but keep in mind, or no, we're not interested. And then you can save a lot of time and start looking for another time, for another journal. When you submit it, eventually, it will be anonymously reviewed by 2 or sometimes more editors. You don't know who the reviewers. We don't know who the reviewers are, but you get their reviews. That can be very unpleasant. Some people, you think, fuck, they haven't read it, but all the comments, it's in the paper. Yeah, but apparently not in a clear way. So always take comments very serious, which is not the same as always follow them. Because it's also an interpretation of somebody. If somebody says, well, you need to address so and so, then you're entitled to say, I really thought about it, but I'm not going to do it for these and these reasons. But make sure that you communicate with that with the editors of the journal, so that they know so that at least they know you're not lazy, but you even thought about it. But for academic reasons, you chose something else. Well, a couple of other things is don't try to write too much. I've seen so many papers, they are unreadable because it's too much. Everything needs to be discussed, or the entire literature needs to be repeated. Keep it simple. Keep it simple. That's already difficult enough. Write in a compact way. So very often you see, well, these are 3 sentences, but you can argue the same in 1 sentence. It's always better. Title, make sure that the title is clear. Sometimes you have titles and you have no idea what it is. Make sure it's clear and that it speaks to a wide readership, not to a few specialists. The introduction, keep it short and keep it very clear. You need to take the reader by the hand and sort of show him or her your research and why you did it and what you found. Theory is very important because we claim to be more than journalists. So theory is key, but not too much. It's not important to address 12 theories and say, well, there's this theory, but we dismissed it, and eventually we came to that theoretical notion, and I'm testing that. No, just only discuss the last one and explain your case. Mind the word count. So if a journal say, well, the paper should be 8,000 words, then then 8,001 is not good. And increasingly journals, they block the submission of a paper if it's more than an expected number of words. Write correct English, but it sounds stupid, but you will be surprised to see how many lousy texts are being submitted with typos. Well, typos, use a good spelling checker, or show your draft text, your manuscript, to an expert who has some understanding of the language. And avoid popular slogans. Maybe that's my own hobby, but I get so very tired of things that they are only mentioned here because a lot of people refer to it, but it doesn't add something new. And finally, keep it simple. An average newspaper, I mean, that's what I always have in mind. My mother should be able to read it. Well, she's not the average newspaper reader. I think she's just a bit below that. But somebody who is willing to take an interest should be able to read it. So write in a way that not just specialists are able to read it. And that may require a bit of effort, but that's good. There is this saying, your easy reading is my hard writing. So it takes an effort to write in a way that is accessible to all. Well, those are in a nutshell. I have no idea how I did in terms of time. Oh, 2 minutes late perhaps, but this is sort of my message to you this afternoon.
Thank you so much, Jan, for this very inspiring talk. It really, I think, provided us with lots of useful tips, but also it opened this broader discussion on reflexivity in scholarly work. So I think that's very important. So thanks a lot for that. Indeed, let's open the floor now for any questions, any comments. At this stage, there is no need really to raise your hand. You can simply unmute yourselves if you want, or you can also write your comments or your questions in the chat if you have issues with your microphones as well. Let me open the chat to see if we have something in there. No, not for the moment.
Oh, I have a question. Is there anybody who has published before or is in the process of writing a paper? And if so, what were your considerations? Come on.
Okay, yeah, I mean, as I suppose almost anyone in academia is more or less in the process of writing or preparing or submitting a paper. I mean, and I have this issue in my mind because I think that almost all of us agree on the fact that there is a need to slower the publish or perish way of working in academia, but at the same time, unfortunately, still the very majority, almost all universities and institution, when you apply for a position, the first thing that they look at is where you have published, how many citations you have received, and not citations, for instance, in non-academic or dissemination works, but mainly how many papers did you publish in the first quartile of the Journal of Citation Report or Scopus. So at the end, it seems to me sometimes that we all agree on that, but at the same time, unless there is, I don't know, or a huge revolution or a slow but ongoing process of reform on the side of universities, or we are stuck with this way of doing science that is producing, as you were said, multiplying academic articles that at the end are almost the same except for a very minimum part of the paper. So what can we do at the end about that?
Well, no, you're absolutely right. So I'm very sympathetic to this slow science movement, and I wish everybody did it. But we know not everybody is doing it. And if you want to get a job, as you explained, or once you have a job, you want to move up to become an associate professor or a full professor or whatever. The evaluators, they count, and you can explain whatever you want. That it's in practice, it's not always as black and white, but it's unavoidable that we are able to check off the right boxes. So yeah, what can you do against it? It's not easy, but this is how the system works. I think it's important to keep talking about this with colleagues, with peers. I come from a country where, say, every 6 years the departments are being evaluated and is done collectively. So all sociology departments in the entire country are simultaneously evaluated by the same evaluation committee. The last time this happened, which is I think two years ago or so, or maybe even 3 years ago, I can't remember that. But the last time we really made a point in concert with the other departments that we need to reflect about the hasty way we tend to publish. And fortunately, this was acknowledged by the evaluation committee. In fact, they fully supported it. And that, of course, doesn't mean that things are now totally different. But I see this as just one step in a slow movement towards a different style of writing. And for the rest, it happens automatically, because I don't know how you work in your institution, but where I work, most staff members, if not everybody, is complaining about workload. There's so much work that needs to be done in teaching, in admin, publishing, and whatever. So there is, say, the physical or mental barriers to do even more than that is increasing. And there's only one way to deal with it, and say, for we need to sort of slow down. But again, it's not something that's done or that's acknowledged in an iffy. It requires some more time. Yeah. What I find important is at least an acknowledgement that's sort of getting further widespread, that the way we have developed our system is, there is an element of insanity in it, and that it makes sense to sort of calm down. And we are not lousy scholars if we say, well, let us make a bit more time to write a better paper. I won't see what the problem with that is.
Thank you, Roberta, and Diana as well. I see some comments on the chat. Let's see, I see Vicky. I read through journals, aims and scopes and choose one that looks like a good fit for my paper at the first stage when I start writing, but choosing the right fit and learning about all the journals out there is a large learning curve. It's also hard to keep up with which conversations are actually going on in which journal.
Yeah. Can I say something about it? That is true, but you shouldn't endeavor to do that. There's so much going on in our world There's so much going on. It's impossible to keep track of it, let alone that you're able to take part in all those debates. So a while ago, I myself decided that's what I'm not going to do. So the many topics, I read about it in the newspaper. That's it. But there's a few issues, a few topics that I really pay more attention, because they are very close to what I do myself. But even then, it's impossible to keep track of each and every publication. So it's in that sense, it's a bit of muddling through. What is important, though, is that we, you, me, we really reflect what is it that triggers us? What is it? Which points do we want to make? Which contribution to the academic world do we want to make? And then focus thereon. So it's not so much doing more, more and more and more, but doing a few things very good.
And we also have a question in the chat from Liberty on something that was not tackled in the presentation, but she was wondering if you have some ideas on how to address harassment, either online or in person, as a result of our research.
So I don't know who Liberty is, but do you mean that you publish something and then newspapers, social media folks, etc., they started targeting you because they think
Probably, yes.
Yeah.
I understand.
Yeah, that's well, when that happens, that's very unpleasant. I remember that when I was a PhD student, or even before that, that somebody targeted me in a newspaper. I mean, this was in the previous millennium. I felt very bad, and I felt humiliated. And this was only one sort of letter sent to an article, to a newspaper. Today, with Facebook, Twitter, you mentioned it, it's much more intense, and as if there is no limit. And sometimes there are these campaigns against particular scholars because they bring news that not everybody wants to hear, and that's disgusting. It's disgusting. It's, as an individual, it's difficult to target it, apart from try to ignore it. At the same time, I think organizations of social scientists, the academies of science, research councils, in collaboration with the Minister of Education and Science, they should address this. And probably also in collaboration with journalists, because we need to have a more public debate exactly about this. But having said that, it's very difficult to expect that such debates or such calls to be more careful in communication will be followed by each and everyone, because we really have people who don't trust the minister, they don't trust researchers. And so anything that we do or we say is seen as a proof that they were right. And so that makes it very unpleasant. Finally, I think it's important when this happens that you share it. You need to share it with your colleagues, with your peers, because that's the way to sort of how do you say that, to survive in this world. But eventually, we need to have a more sort of a deeper what is it? Call on the public to maintain certain moral rules. But I'm saying that I feel a bit silly because I know I don't expect that many people will follow it up. So it's an unsatisfactory answer, but no.
We also have another question in the chat from Chiara, but I don't know, Chiara, if you want to ask directly, perhaps.
Thank you. Yes, sure. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfect.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. It was super interesting and really helpful. Co-authors and myself, we found in a weird situation in the last submission process in the last weeks. I am in an ERC project, so we're working with digitalization of third country national data and digital infrastructure, and we have to publish some articles on digital infrastructure and also on international organization. We abide to an ethical policy that the European research programs require, so there is no problem on that. But we have submitted a paper to a journal on Tirol and Francis and realized there is a new ethical policy, or at least the first time that we cross this policy. And I wanted to ask you also to other colleagues your view on that. So I'm referring to the criteria that we have to seek before submitting an article. It's called the consent to publish. And it says, I confirm that any participants or their guardians, if unable to give informed consent, or next of kin if deceased, who may be identifiable through the manuscript, such as a case report, have been given an opportunity to review the final manuscript and have provided written consent to publish. So practically, we don't have the problem because we have all informed consent, anonymous, and all the interviewers were part of that. But here we found a tricky situation in which, while we agree that we do not harm people in doing our job, at the same time we found ourselves in the situation in which the person we are talking about, or the situation or the organization we're talking about, has the power to review the manuscript, but with the complicated implications, as far as my argument, for instance, cannot be understood in the same way as researchers do. What could be the perception of the person that has to give the permission to publish, and why I should go through this process of being confirmed? I mean, I don't know whether it is clear, my question, but
yeah, I know. For me, it's clear. Yeah.
What is your opinion on that? Because
yeah, well, I hate this shit. It's
perfect.
Okay, but let me explain that. I think it's good that we have ethical standards, and they include things like whatever we do, we should make an effort. So really an effort to protect the ones who were so willing to share their opinion or experiences with us, etc., etc. We also need to explain who we are. So you can't say you can't jump on somebody, but you need to tell what the purpose is. And of course, it doesn't mean that you need to read 30 papers from your research proposal, but somebody needs to understand, this is a researcher, or at least somebody who's collecting information, and I'm one of the informants, and so on and so forth. So in itself, that's good. But I'm a professor of sociology, but I was trained as an anthropologist. And anthropologists, they have a totally different work field. So they go into the fields, and many things are very informal. So you could even imagine that when you have a laboratory where somebody needs to knock on the door and then will be welcomed, you can say, take a seat, and now we will ask questions. There's a very controlled situation. And then it's easier to have those forms. But when you're sort of in a community in Brazil or in Nigeria or whatever, you chat a bit here, you hear somebody there, in the bus you have a brief chat with somebody who mentioned things and think, oh, that's interesting, and then I'm supposed to say, but hold, and I have a form you need to sign, as if somebody can read it. So there's so many barriers against really using it that it even becomes nonsensical to ask those questions. So what I find, but don't tell it to other people, but I really think that all these pressures to have more and more and more rules, they basically pave the way for a rather scientific kind of approach, a controlled approach in a laboratory, but not, say, the world in which notably more qualitative or interpretative researchers are working. That it's very, very difficult. That doesn't mean that we can say, well, throw it in the bin. You can't do that. There's another reason why I have problems with those rules. So let's say I'm interested in studying the transnational connections that are now being mobilized among Turkish families with maybe relatives, friends, and family members who are the victims of the earthquake. So it's you can be very open what you do. I think you should be very open, and in order to get the collaboration. But what if I want to study organized crime, or I want to study how say multinationals, how in the boardrooms of multinationals decisions are being made? Well, of course, they won't even allow me to sit in that. But let's say I find a way to get access. Then I'm supposed not to. Then I'm supposed to tell everybody who I am, and everybody is willing to collaborate. No. So some individuals from institutions are able to use those rules to protect themselves, whereas people at the lower ranks of society, they're not able to protect themselves. So it doesn't feel good. Does that help you? No. It's sort of I'm sort of complaining about it, maybe in the same way as you would do. I think what this journal is asking you to basically to say you're not the one who makes a decision about submitting a manuscript, but it's an individual whom you interview. I think it's nonsensical. It's fundamentally in opposition to what social science entails, because you always need to have control of every bit of the process. And what I would do, I would not submit any paper to that journal. But that's probably not in your interest. I have no idea what to do. I would protest. I would say this is nonsense. And maybe even, so if it's a philosophy journal, there are these organizations of philosophers, or if it's a sociological journal, the National Sociological Association or the international one, you say, what do we think about that? But again, for you, unless you want to lie, you should just take, but that's not to be recommended. I have no idea how to solve it. I don't know how other people feel about this, but I really have no idea how to deal with it other than turning your back. So what have you done, Chiara?
We don't have a really specific issue, as we already had a informed consent signed by participants. Yeah. We're aware of that, and for this specific case, we were just saying, okay, for now it's okay. We all have what we need without need to lie or pretend or something or anything else. But at the same time, since an organization is mentioned there, and also because we wished in the beginning to have some work with also law enforcement bodies, not for this paper, but for future papers, we were thinking about, but what if we submit another paper for this journal, and this journal is asking to a research team to submit the paper to the law enforcement, to the national authorities of this European country, and still we're talking about European countries, because there is also the other issue, as you already mentioned, of doing research outside Europe and in authoritarian countries. I've been in Tunisia many years, so if I should have the permission from Tunisian police forces, this would
you can buy it.
Oh, yeah, it's easier, maybe. Yes, of course. We don't say that, but again, the other way is this is limiting the academic activity.
Exactly. Yeah.
So my question is also conveying the message: isn't there a debate about that? Because we've witnessing this with the Taylor and Francis, with journals in Taylor and Francis, which are the best for our partners, as we already said. They are also very good journals. I mean, it's not just about numbers, scopus, and quotation. They are very good journals, but it's becoming more and more complicated.
Yeah. Well, I know that the introduction of ever newer rules, there is discussion about it, but this goes even further than I ever imagined. And I'm hearing it for the first time. But I would love to have such a discussion, but actually I would love to have a more broader discussion because this is not a standalone thing. And it's not just about sort of protecting the rights of the people whom we study. I see it also as a sign of distrust and a way of say protecting imagined potential victims. And within universities, so when we're not talking about publishing, but even in universities, it's increasingly difficult to have discussions about each and any topic in which everything can be said. And so people need to be protected. This is not to say that you should sort of call names to everybody, but it's as if we are not grown-up people who are able to communicate about any topic. And so in that upfront, so before anything happens, we say, well, we don't want that person to talk, we don't want that topic to be addressed, we don't want to hear this perspective because it's offensive or whatsoever. I find it very problematic, and I see this as just another thing. And what I also noticed is that to a large extent it's ad hoc. So in the Netherlands we have new rules. Well, it's not so very new anymore, but there was an introduction of a new way of showing how you carried out your research, and people should be able to check it. So you need to put everything in a depository, etc. It was in response to one individual who really messed up his project. I mean, there was an anthropologist who built a career. I mean, I'm not kidding, but a career on the basis of research in a village that doesn't exist. But so there's a few extreme cases, and they get the news. But let's say one or two people who mess up their research, they really spoil the work of a few thousand other people who just comply to the rules. And I find it very annoying. I can say that. Yeah.
Yeah, by the way, my supervisor is coming from Twente. She's Italian, Annalisa Pelizza, but she was in Twente before coming to Bologna. So
okay, she got her share of it. Yeah.
At some point, I saw Colleen. You had your hand in there. I don't know if you wanted to add something to this.
Do we have time?
We can have 2 more minutes, perhaps. I don't know at what time we will close this thing.
Yeah, it's just a quick question. Thanks so much for the talk and all the information. And I was wondering, when you were talking about the communication and dissemination strategy and how you want to be perceived by, I guess your colleagues in the community and everybody else, that you can choose between generalist or more specialist. And recently I received some advice within the context of Dutch academia that I need to start specializing. And I was wondering if you agree with that in terms of, I guess, pragmatically, career-wise, because in terms of intellectual curiosity, I prefer the generalist route because there's so much more different, because there's so many opportunities for collaboration available and just learning about more things. But I also
well,
want to be pragmatic.
I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all kind of solution. It depends what you want to do. Sometimes it's good to find a very specialized journal, but specialized also means that you're only talking to specialists, and that somebody who has an adjacent speciality will never be able to see it. So that's the payoff. How do you call that? So that's the price that you pay.
Yeah, the trade-off.
The trade-off, yeah. There's something else that you may want to consider. I have a colleague in the ranks of assistant professor, so junior professor, and she wants to move up.
Mhm.
And she discovered that her CV was not, as she felt it, was not fully appreciated. So she asked me, can you have a look and just tell me what I should do different? And what we discovered was that she had done excellent work, something here, something else there. So she was actually not a specialist, but somebody who had a collection of specialities. And I think that's an enormous skill, that you're able apparently to dive into a topic and to sort of tease out something and get an academic publication or more publications, and then you move to the other topic. That's a skill. There's nothing wrong with it. But when you talk about her, say, what's her specialty? Yeah. Everything becomes a bit. It's a bit vague, it's a bit this. Oh, I thought she would do that. So in that sense, it's helpful to build a trajectory around a particular theme. That could be a general theme. So let's say you're interested in migration governance, but you present it as I'm interested in governance, which is a very broad topic, governance of social problems. And your case happened to be about migration. So that's a different way of presenting it, and for which a different outlet makes sense. And so it's sort of in that way that I think you need to look at your own work. And in migration studies, many people are world famous in migration, but not elsewhere. And it's because they take migration as a starting point. My recommendation is take something else, something more general as a starting point, and use migration as a case.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much, Jan, for this very rich discussion. There is, I guess, after this presentation, after this discussion that we had, there is a whole part which is the idea with what you started of dissemination to policymakers, to the media, engaging with journalists and so on and so forth, that we didn't unfortunately have the chance to further develop, but perhaps we can leave that for another session if you still have the time to engage with our group in ECPR. Thank you so much for your willingness to share with us today these tips and these ideas. And thank you all for joining the webinar. We will see each other again next month with new presentation. Thanks so much, and take good care of yourselves.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. And you can always call me or send an email, whatever, if you need more information.
Will do.
It was a pleasure to do, Daniela.
Thank you so much, Jan.
Thank
Take
you,
good care of
Jan.
yourselves. Have a nice
Okay.
afternoon. Bye.
Bye-bye.